for being the last speaker, because I imagine everyone is either kind of got that nice exhaustion of having heard loads of great things, and I also have to follow the three brilliant speakers that came before me. So I'll try and be as quick as I can with my talk to finish it. But,
it's amazing. You're all in for a treat. I'm going to hand over and mute you. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you. So yeah, my talk is called "Do Not Worship False Idols." It was quite a challenging talk to write at first. I'm going to be talking about historical figures, mainly women, and how we as modern feminists reconcile ourselves with, and I'm stealing Megan's phrase from earlier because she put it so wonderfully, juxtaposing ideologies of our past heroes. And there's a couple of things I want to say before I begin. Well, as I was writing this, I realised how easily this can reflect contemporary activism today. Social media has made it so easy to wade back into people's lives and to hold them account for what they once said or did or tweeted. And it is easier for people to be held to account, but it's also easier, I find, in society today through more empathetic, progressive and outspoken activism for people to change and learn and grow and gain more values and different opinions, because better education and open conversation is much more widely accepted. Some of my personal favourite things and examples of this is Charlie Craig's travelling nail transphobia pop-up that travels the country and educates people on trans rights, to more widespread national celebrations. So for example, in 2017, when sort of the heritage world and nationally we really marked the partial discrimination of homosexual acts, and then in 2018 of some women being able to vote. And these all shone a light on the constant inequalities that remain to be fixed. They showed how far we've come, but also how far we've got left to go. So our radical history, which really is left out of schools, we never learn about it, does become part of our celebratory public narrative, so much so that it can become quite Disneyfied in public memory. These plots just start to unfold with goodies and baddies, and the righteous always win because we've got justice on our side. And in the 2015 film Suffragette, if anyone saw it, the protagonist, Maud, has this really fleeting encounter with Emily Pankhurst, played by Meryl Streep, whose small screen time just increases this mythical and sort of godlike status of her as this faraway figure of encouragement and righteousness and glory. So these sorts of public perceptions, they sort of blur the lines between fact and fiction. And this always makes me go back to a theory that I learned at uni from a professor. I did classics at uni, which is how I ended up in 20th century social history, that's what turned me to it. A professor of Greek literature and language called Richard Buxton, he had this theory when we look at Greek myths. So if you ever learn at primary school, this is the only Greek myth I think I ever learned at primary school, the Trojan horse, which I think everyone's heard of at some point, whether it's the Brad Pitt film or school, is that he has this peach and onion theory. So Greek myths aren't like onions, which you just take away and peel away layer after layer and there's nothing there at the end. But instead, these Greek myths are peaches, and enclosed in the middle of all this flesh is a stone, and that stone is the true history. There's a core there. And I think you can apply that theory to radical history as well. And I think that we turn radicals of the past into peaches. But when we sort of strip away at that sweet flesh around them, the myth of the heroics are taken and they're gone, and we're quite disappointed at what we find at the core of them. And Megan mentioned that I wrote a book last year, which is very exciting, about 20 radical women who shaped Manchester. And I'm going to be like, I'm doing a little show and tell. This is my book. Isn't it lovely? I'm very proud of my book. And when I was writing this, I encountered this problem over and over again of what we find at the core of these radical women. Now, I said it was about 20 women. I didn't make up this list. It was a list given to me by my publishers, and in fact, it was the long list of women chosen for the statue of Emily Pankhurst, which is now in St. Peter's Square in Manchester. So this list wasn't carefully curated by a historian or a curator, and I don't actually think it should have been, because this list had come from the public. Names had been submitted by the hundreds to Andrew Simcock, who was the councillor leading the project. And it was the same members of the public who stood up in the council chambers and argued for each of these women in the selection process. So these women, this list of 20 women, were women who touched the heart of the public, and these people wore them like a badge of honour. They saw them as idols who were worthy of a bronze statue to literally lay tribute at their feet. And if anyone goes past the Emily Pankhurst statue, in Manchester, I walk past it every day for work, which is quite nice. But I always see flowers and tokens left for her. And it shows how much the memory of these radical heroes become embroiled in our own sense of self and our own identity. But then you get the opposing side. So in 2017, when I was preparing the Represent exhibition that Megan mentioned when I was curating that, I was approached by an external organisation who wanted a list of radical women from Manchester because they were organising an event and they wanted to have the tables named after them, to celebrate the centenary. But don't include the Pankhursts, they said, because we don't want racists or anti-Semites on our list. Now, this is an example of that peach being subverted when a myth, because this is quite a far-stretched myth, that surrounds the truth from the revelations of questionable and backwards views. So actually what gets built up around the true core of the person is the negative aspects and that juxtaposing ideology that they followed as opposed to their radical and celebratory one. Even when they were talking about the Pankhurst, there was no mention of Sylvia Pankhurst, arguably the most radical and the most left-wing, who is erased simply due to her relationship to her more right-wing mother and sister. So there are two clear paths here: public adoration and cancel culture. Now, the Suffragettes, or the Women's Social and Political Union, of which Emily Pankhurst founded, perhaps the most common example here of how heroised women fall from grace suddenly in our eyes. Because whilst we often appropriate the colours of purple, white and green, which were on their logo, we use them today in so many of our campaigns, and a lot of sort of women's charities use them as well. We also often kind of balk at the idea that they turn coat and join the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party had completely stamped on these women's hopes of ever voting. So we can't reconcile these two things together. And then there's women like Mary Richardson. So Mary very famously walked into the National Gallery in 1914, took a meat cleaver and smashed the Rokeby Venus. The Rokeby Venus, I wish I had a picture to show you, but it's that very famous picture of the lady lying on her side, naked, with her kind of looking over her shoulder back out of the frame. It's in St. Trinian's, which is kind of how I remember it as well, which is quite embarrassing. But she smashed this portrait and she was imprisoned in this fight for the vote for over 10 years. She constantly put her life at risk. She was an incredible activist. But then after the suffrage campaign ended, after 19, she went on to become the head of the women's section in Oswald Moses' British Union of Fascists, alongside other suffragettes like Nora Dacre Fox. So Richardson was inspired by the same element of militancy and fanaticism she'd grown accustomed to in the WSPU. And as she became the head of the women's section, she really believed in the ideology that the BUF, the British Union of Fascists, would be the next step in the advancement for women, particularly in politics. For the most part, ex-suffragettes often turn to new political campaigns like this for that next step, hoping to emulate something of their glory years they'd had in the suffrage movement. Everything had moved quite fast towards the end of the 1910s, and suddenly it was moving very slowly. Now, this was a really personal blow, I felt, when I found out about Mary Richardson and her sort of fascism, because the Rokeby Venus smashing was a moment that I absolutely coveted as a researcher. I loved it, especially because Mary Richardson is one of the few suffragettes who actually recorded in the 1960s with the BBC interviews about her activism. And she actually says to the young female reporter, she'd gone on a reconnaissance trip to the National Gallery a couple of days earlier, and she'd stood back and watched men leer over this painting, and she was absolutely horrified about how the nude body of a woman was being subverted and turned into something for men just to gawp at. And that was one of the reasons she wanted to destroy something under which the male gaze kind of grew and blossomed. So to find out that someone had such forward thinking and progressive action even in 1914, for her to have fallen into fascism was quite shocking, and I didn't know how to feel about it. But there are these clear thought patterns, and they're misinformed thought patterns. And I want to stress now, I'm not apologising for any of these women and their awful opinions. But you can see why they move into them, because they're trying to pick up that mantle again. And there were loads of causes that the suffragettes took up like this, be it fascism, communism. In Christabel Pankhurst's case, it was born again religion after she moved to America. This became a really common afterlife for suffragettes, an afterlife that we don't often attribute to them. They didn't just go out of the public eye or the political eye when they won the vote. But we do tend to care less about a person or a woman's political actions when the deed they're famous for is non-political. So, for example, in First in the Fight, the political opinions and beliefs of Sunny Lowry, who was one of the first women to swim the Channel, become quite redundant. There's no record or archive of who she voted for. We don't know whether she identified as a feminist, what opinions she might have had on immigration or poll tax or Thatcher. Whereas on the other hand, the unnerving and frankly terrifying commitment to eugenics made Mary Stopes, who was one of the first women to advocate for birth control for women, made her the most challenging person to write about in the entire book. Having struggled for years to write married love and give women a chance to kind of control their constant pregnancies, it's quite gut-wrenching to try and reconcile the racist values of a woman who had been so committed to the liberties given to women who were freed, who she helped to free from constant childbirth. It shows that if you present yourself on the side of justice, if you cast yourself in the role as a goodie, you must prove that you're good through and through. What's interesting about Mary Stopes' views particularly is that often people say, well, it's the time she lived in. No, at the time Mary Stopes lived in, there was an outcry against eugenics. This cannot be an excuse we give to women for having these sorts of views. But it becomes clear as we keep looking at these stories that it's a feminist issue. Very rarely do we subject the men of history to the same scrutiny of right or wrong. There are debates that have been struck up about statues, and indeed there's a lot of challenge against slave traders and plantation owners, which is a step in the right direction, but others are completely and blatantly ignored. Constant idolisation of Churchill, which drives me absolutely mad, despite his outwardly racist and imperialist views, to men like James Cook and his famous sailing of the seas. He was awful. He was an absolutely awful human being. But these heroes of our time, particularly the male heroes, they're not a peach. They don't have their flesh stripped back to the core. They're onions, because simply in public memory, they are layers and layers of glorious myth. We never see what's at the heart. But women were, and still are today, particularly if we look at women politicians today, held to a moral standard. Can't get my words out. Are held to a higher moral standard than men. So the title of my talk is Do Not Worship False Idols. But this isn't to say do not value these historical figures. Don't suddenly abandon the books you want to read about or the colours of their movement as symbols of carrying on your fight. Start by looking at the reasons behind these darker histories. Like Mary Richardson, it was a bid to regain the feeling of progression and loyalty that she had felt as a suffragette. For others, like Mary Stopes, we can't find a reasoning, and we shouldn't feel a need to justify her, because we don't have to apologise for these women. We don't have to make excuses, but we also shouldn't be wiping them from the books. What we should be doing is giving them back their humanity. We can appreciate what they may have done, but we have to remember, not one of these women acted alone. There's no David and Goliath, there's no sort of Joan of Arc against armies. It's very complex, it's long, it's drawn out, it's a soul-destroying movement. And when we look to embody these amazing acts like winning the vote for women in one person, or embodying it in one person, or putting it on a single pedestal, that's where the problems start to happen. We should look at the broader campaigns that celebrate the women around them. So having stripped your heroine or hero, and I hate those words, back to their core, and start to understand both the light and shade that dominates their life and actions, then it's time to look beyond them to this collective, to the movement. Mary Richardson was a cog in a machine that bought us the vote, as was Mary Stopes for birth control. We must celebrate the cause and the outcomes, celebrate the women who worked around them, celebrate this collective action. Even Churchill was simply part of an administration that helped us to win the war, and he wasn't the person shooting the shots at the end battle. So I'm going to go back to this Greek myth for a moment, because the answer might lie there. The gods and goddesses who lived on Mount Olympus, like Zeus and Athena and Aphrodite, they were all worshipped and given sacrifices and libations and tributes. And the bards and the poets of the day, they gave us those myths of these gods and goddesses, and we see them murdering their rivals, we see them raping, pillaging, having affairs, starting wars. They were horrible. But for all these things, we see the gods and goddesses being punished, often by each other or sometimes by, a human. These are false idols, but the point of them was not to hold them as perfect embodiments. They didn't exist for us they didn't exist for the ancient Greeks, not us, to copy, but to learn from. If they did something right in this myth or in the song that the poet sang, you could follow it. But if they committed an error, you were supposed to learn from your mistake. Like, don't sleep with your brother's don't sleep with your brother's wife, or you might get caught in a huge net that falls down on you, which actually happened to a couple of gods. So I don't really have the answer to this, except maybe let's not build statues. And maybe the way to honour these women, these radical women, is to remember them as they were, to simply keep their record, their achievements and their failures. Perhaps when we accept that our idols made mistakes and let us down and disappointed us, that's when we learn from them, just like the ancient Greeks learned from their gods. Maybe we won't be so afraid of falling or tricking up or saying the wrong thing or making an error of judgment, because maybe it will pave the way for us to grow and learn and progress in our activism in the way that those who came before us could not. Thank you very much for this.